The air is thick, a suffocating mix of heavy incense, myrrh oil, and something faintly metallic, almost like fear. The only light comes from the dying sun filtering through layers of silk curtains, casting the chamber in a sickly amber glow. We are not in the splendor of Susa or the majesty of Persepolis. We are deep inside the private fortress of the king, the harem. The servants' fingers move quickly across soft skin, spraying perfume oil in trembling silence. Their hands shake, but not from cold. The young girl before them is barely more than a child. Her collared bones jut out beneath the thin veil. She doesn't know whether she's the Hunt or Theethausen thin line. The numbers have lost all meaning here. Only one truth remains, chilling her blood with every heartbeat. The man waiting in the adjoining room isn't just the king of kings, not only the ruler of millions from India to Greece, not merely the living embodiment of Ahura Mazda. He is also her father, outwardly. The Persian Empire is the wonder of the world, a colossal engine of conquest and governance. Xerxes, the first king of kings, comes into unimaginable wealth and holds absolute power over life and death. But power, when it reaches its final form, does not only rule lands, it corrodes the soul. It demands greater and greater transgressions just to feel alive. And behind the gold-plated walls and chambers guarded by eunuchs, where no mortal law can enter, absolute power mutates into absolute depravity. This is not a story of grand battles. It is a story of a prison draped in silk and of a crime buried by its own bloodline. A secret so dark that Greek historians only dared whisper it, never writing it clearly. To understand Xerxes' fall, we must first understand the machinery that created him. The royal Persian harem was not merely a pleasure palace. It was a political institution, a state within a state operating under its own hidden laws. When Xerxes inherited the throne from his father, Darius the Great, he didn't just inherit territories. He inherited this system of control. The harem was a tool of power built in depths of the palace. It was designed so that no one could enter without permission and no one could ever leave. Endless corridors, cedar doors as thick as stone, inner gardens where sunlight was trapped forever. Inside lived hundreds of women, a living mosaic of Persia's conquests. There were princesses from defeated kingdoms sent as tokens of peace. Daughters of noble Persians offered as tributes to secure family loyalty. Dancers, musicians, concubines from every province. Each had her rank in a strict hierarchy. They were property of the empire. And who ran this luxurious prison? The eunuchs. Men stripped of their ability to father children and with it stripped of all loyalty to blood or lineage. Their only allegiance was to the king. They were administrators, spies, gatekeepers. In Achaemenid executions, they controlled access, food, jewels, the visiting calendar, and most importantly, information. Every woman who entered the harem underwent a meticulous transformation. They were trained in the arts of pleasure, music, dance, and refined conversion. Some through intimacy could influence the king's decisions. But it was a deadly game. A whisper at the right time could raise a concubine to royal wife. A glance at the wrong moment could mean instant death. It was a world of silent conspiracies, false smiles, and daggers hidden beneath silk sleeves. The perfect prison. A golden cage where inmates were dressed in the finest fabrics and fed the richest foods, yet stripped forever of their autonomy. And within this cage, a new tragedy began to take root. One even its creators hadn't fully foreseen. Children were being born within its walls. When a concubine gave birth to a daughter, that child's fate was sealed from her first cry. These girls, Xerxes' own daughters, grew up in the same walls that imprisoned their mothers. They were princesses, but they had no status. Unlike the daughters of royal wives, they weren't prepared for political marriages with princes or noblemen. Their position existed in a terrifying gray zone. Carriers of royal blood, yet treated as part of the harem's inventory from childhood. Their world was the labyrinth. They watched their mothers and hundreds of other women live in eternal waiting for the king's call. They breathed the air of rivalry, jealousy, and sexual submission. Our omniscient gaze sees their indoctrination, learning to walk, speak, and use their eyes. But above all to obey. They were taught that their bodies did not belong to them. They belonged to the empire, and the empire was the king. Meanwhile, the man who fathered them was changing. After catastrophic military defeats against the Greeks, especially Thebatal of Salamis, Xerxes grew increasingly paranoid and cruel. He had tried to conquer the outside world and failed. Now he turned inward, determined to rule as a god over the only realm he could fully control, the harem. This is where the psychology of limitless power begins to rot. When you can have anything you want, gratification becomes boring. When hundreds of the empire's most beautiful women are ready to submit, beauty becomes meaningless. Submission loses its thrill. Absolute power stops seeking satisfaction. It seeks transgression. It needs stronger stimuli, new boundaries to break just to feel alive. Greek historians like Herodotus recorded the first warning signs. They told Xerxes' obsession with his own brother's wife, Miss, when she rejected him. The king turned his desire toward her daughter, his Aunis, and forced her into a relationship. A pattern was forming. The boundaries of blood and family began to blur in the mind of a man who saw himself as divine. To Xerxes, everything and everyone was an extension of his will. He ruled nations. He possessed women. And most terrifyingly, he possessed the children he created. As his daughters born in the harem reached puberty, the ambiguity of their status became their sentence. They weren't sent away for marriage. They weren't allowed to leave. They were kept for an unspoken purpose. They remained within reach of the same men who had sired them. The eunuchs knew, the servants knew, their mothers knew, and they were all horrified in silence. But in the harem, silence was survival. Anyone who spoke, even whispered, vanished without a trace. The system of control worked perfectly. It was built to protect the king's secrets at any cost. Transgression was no longer an idea. It was becoming practice. Greek physician historian Ctesias, who served in the Persian court and had access to royal archives, hinted at the depth of corruption within, though his works survive only in fragments. They paint a picture of moral decay so extreme that the darkest habits become a daily routine. Behind the palace walls for these young princesses, coercion was absolute. How could one say no to the man who was simultaneously her father, her king, and her living God? They were prisoners born inside the cage, raised for the pleasure of their jailer. The system didn't just allow it, it facilitated it. Eunuchs, whose only purpose was to fulfill the king's wishes, prepared and delivered these girls to him. There was no morality, only logistics. The architecture of the harem itself reserved the secret. Isolated chambers connected by hidden corridors ensured that what happened inside the king's private rooms remained invisible to the heirs of the palace. Xerxes, suffocated by his own power, no longer saw people, only objects for his use. Dehumanization was complete. His daughters were not family. They were the most exclusive trophies of his collection. The air inside the harem grew heavier with each passing season. A sense of paranoia seeped into the very walls. Mothers tried to hide their daughters, but it was useless. The eunuchs kept precise records. When the king requested one of them, there was no appeal, no hesitation. The command of Xerxes was law, and law was unquestionable. This was the same man who had once ordered the sea itself to be whipped with chains, punishing the waves for destroying his bridge to Greece. Now that same irrational tyranny was turned inward toward his own blood. The outer empire began to crack, but the empire within his palace had already descended into nightmare. Even in ancient times, when moral standards were far removed from our own, the union of father and daughter was an unthinkable taboo. In Egypt, pharaohs sometimes married their sisters. In Persia, a custom called sweta allowed marriages between cousins or even half-siblings to preserve the purity of their royal bloodline. But the relationship between a father and his daughter, that was the final boundary, a line that even the cruelest tyrants rarely dared to cross. For Xerxes, that was exactly its allure. Breaking the ultimate taboo was proof of ultimate power. It was a declaration that he stood above every law, human, natural, or divine. The one act left to Almond, who already possessed everything Tafil. That something still remained for Biden. The room is thick with perfume. The young girl, the king's daughter, is led inside. The eunuchs take their posts outside the door. Their faces are masks of stone. They hear everything but register nothing. They are breathing wolves. Our view now shifts to the men of the victim. There is no concept of consent here. No even the illusion of it. How could Shedney, the man who literally holds power over her life and death, the man who is her,